Good. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning. So some of you know a little bit about my professional background as a hospital chaplain. And I've spoken before about how the themes, particularly about suffering and dying and death, are prominent and significant parts of my work and my practice. Both about how my meditation practice and Buddhist studies have informed my professional work, but also how my professional work, both the lived experience I have and witness experiences, continues to inform my Buddhist practice as well. There's another element of my professional work that's come more into focus over the past year, and that's some very special work around suicide prevention and intervention. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and what I'm going to say is constructed to be a safe conversation, but if there's something that comes to mind or something you recall that's difficult and you need to step outside for a moment, please take care of yourself and do so. And just know that this is a safe space and nothing I'm going to say is meant to be triggering in any way. So about 2 weeks ago was probably my most demanding week of work, both physically, mentally, and emotionally, but also the most meaningful and rewarding kind of span of work. And what I did was I worked to organize, host, and facilitate 3 full days of suicide intervention and training workshops. On Wednesday, through the hospital, we organized and hosted a prevention workshop aimed at religious leaders called Soul Shop. Reverend Bup Mee was able to join us for that workshop, which was great. And we gathered nearly 50 people, about 20 hospital and hospice chaplains and 30 different people from around the metro area and larger region, coming from various churches and faith communities of pastors and ministers and teachers and other lay leaders from various denominations. The next 2 days, myself and one of my colleagues, our pediatric chaplain, facilitated our first suicide intervention workshop called ASSIST, which is an acronym that stands for Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training, for a group of 30. This group was comprised of nurses and social workers, physicians, and chaplains as well too, and a few crisis line counselors from Common Ground and that answer our local 988 lifeline number. That workshop taught participants how to perform a suicide intervention and to lead a person that's having thoughts of suicide to safety through listening to their story and helping to co-create a safety plan. So while these 2 workshops had different specific objectives and methods, they shared a common goal in striving to equip participants to cultivate what we call suicide-safer communities. So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the insights from me and my team's work in prevention and intervention, and hopefully over the time that I'm talking, help to address and maybe even dispel some of the myths and fears and confusion that keep this topic taboo and hidden and not spoken about in our culture. So this work and focus on prevention for me started in the hospital a few years ago when I was called as the chaplain to meet a 17-year-old boy who had survived a serious attempt and was hospitalized in the ICU for several months to undergo numerous surgeries. And I'll just call him Jack. That's not his real name, but that's what I'll call him in this talk. So for me initially, I was quite afraid and anxious on how to best meet Jack and what to say, and also nervous and unsure about how to start and how to connect with him, especially given he was unable to speak due to his injury, and he was breathing with the help of a ventilator connected to his trachea. It took for me being both willing and able to be present with my own discomfort and uncertainty, and to make a commitment not to turn away. Not to turn away not only from Jack, but really not to turn away from myself. What I realized then was that I was projecting onto Jack my own fears, my own anxieties, my sadness, confusion, and insecurity. There was an impulse within me to turn away from myself and my own experience in that moment. The three poisons we speak about in Buddhist practice, ignorance, attachment, and aversion, were definitely really active in myself at this time. And I only realized much later that Jack and I had more in common than I saw initially, and that I could see the parallels in our lives. Some of the conditions that pushed Jack to his own suicide attempt, in part, wanting to escape and avert pain, paralleled in some small way my aversion to being uncomfortable with this discomfort I was feeling, to allow myself to really fully be present with Jack. I resisted letting myself be vulnerable when I needed to be for Jack. But Jack and I were really not that different. Only our causes and conditions, our particular life circumstances at this moment were different, that led to different paths in life. In reality, though, it didn't take too long for this debilitating part of my discomfort to subside. With intention and perseverance, and realistically, maybe only after about an hour or so, did my initial panic mostly evaporate. My emotional guard lowered, and I was able to open up and actually see Jack and hear his story, rather than staying stuck on my own story. Creating available mental and emotional space to actually hear someone else's story, to effectively monitor our own inner dialogue in stressful moments, is not automatic, and it can be really hard to do sometimes. It requires attention and effort. So this is where my meditation practice probably helped me the most, by having strengthened this habit to pause, take some deep breaths, stabilize myself, and kind of put in check, at least for a few moments, my own story. Mostly, which was fear of not knowing what to do, or fear that I might not be able to be helpful to Jack. Some of that story and that fear was able to recognize and to see, right? But it wasn't the dominant story. I was able to set that aside for a moment so I could tune in and be with Jack. The story was still there. It didn't go away. It just wasn't as strong as it was initially. So over the next several weeks in the hospital, Jack and I had a lot of deep and serious conversations about what had precipitated his own suicide attempt, the pain and hurt he had felt, his feelings about not being good enough, about not belonging, conversations about regret, guilt, and shame, and also ambivalence. But also we had conversations about his faith. He's a Christian, practice in a youth group, and also about trust and gratitude for second chances. And also his desire in this time now to see that he had an opportunity to craft a new purpose for his life. He wanted to share and talk about his experience after he recovered, to help his school community, to have honest and open conversations about suicide, and a desire to help his peers and his friends find better ways to cope with stress and difficult emotions so that they could stay safe. One of the big myths around suicide is that talking about suicide will lead to and encourage suicide. The truth, though, is that talking about suicide not only reduces stigma, but it also allows individuals to seek help, to rethink their opinions and options, and to share their story with others. Talking and asking about suicide reduces and decreases suicide risk. Jack and I also had easy conversations, talking about movies, video games, times with his friends and visitors. And by the end of his hospitalization, he was sharing with me some of his favorite recipes for homemade fudge, which was actually really good. I spent a lot of time with Jack's mom, too, in the ICU family lounge, in the cafeteria, in the chapel at different hours of different days, sometimes at 8 a.m. or sometimes at 10 p.m., just depending what was going on and when we were both there. We talked about her experience of what had happened to Jack, what it meant to her, how it affected their family, her own emotions, and her own hopes as well, too. Before meeting Jack and his mom, I was overwhelmed with deep feelings of being inadequate, of, like I said, not knowing what to say or how to comfort them, or even if I could. And in chaplaincy practice, what I went through, we learn how to reflect on our caregiving through the lens of our own religious tradition. So what I interpreted later on as I was reflecting on my relationship with them was one of the primary spiritual needs of Jack and his mom was for me, as I saw it, during that time to manifest and embody for them Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, or Gwanseum Bosal that we say in Korean. Avalokiteshvara, that word, that name of that Bodhisattva, means something like the Lord who looks down upon the world. And in many cultural contexts and translations, it also means the one who hears the cries of the world. Compassion meaning to be with suffering. So Jack and his mom needed someone to look at them and to really see them amidst all the physical conditions and circumstances that were going on, but to also see their smiles, their strength, and their courage. Jack and his mom needed someone to hear their cries of sadness and loss, of anger, of confusion, but also to hear their hopes and their dreams, their gratitude and their joy over the course of their time at the hospital. And Jack and his mom needed someone to practice compassion, to be with them in their suffering as they navigated challenges and uncertainties. Challenges and uncertainties about medical treatment, about surgeries, prognosis and rehabilitation, and what we call re-entry, about how to eventually return home and to school and confront family and friends, their school, their congregation, and strangers for the first time since all this happened, and how to do that. Hearing the cries of the world, to show up, remain present, be quiet, bear witness, and hold space. So after meeting Jack and his family in the hospital, very soon after that, we had another case of a 16-year-old boy who was hospitalized on the same floor in the same unit, also with a serious suicide attempt. The cries of the world were getting louder. So it was the fall of 2019, right before COVID really came about around here, that we created a new protocol at the hospital, quite possibly the first of its kind, where the chaplains would seek out and offer spiritual care support to all patients in the hospital that were assessed to have some elevated risk of suicide for whatever reason at any age. We're still doing that now since we started it, and we'll continue to do that. And we see patients as young as 9 or 10 years old, and also patients in their 90s, all the way through. At that time, while we had an adult inpatient psychiatry unit, we saw an average of 30 to 40 patients in the hospital on any given day. So while Jack's story and experience is unique, it's tragically too common. Suicide is the 12th leading cause of death in the United States overall, and the third leading cause of death for ages 10 to 19, the second leading cause for ages 20 to 34, and the fourth leading cause for ages 35 to 44. Here in Oakland County, 153 people died from suicide last year. In 2020, there were reported nearly 46,000 suicide deaths across the country, although the real number is estimated to be much higher due to underreporting. So this is the equivalent of a 737 airplane falling out of the sky every single day. During this morning service today, statistically, 6 people will die. 54% of adults will have known someone who died by suicide in their lifetime, including in our own Sangha. Just last summer, we learned that Anakala Dustin Hamilton of the first Muddy Water Zen precept family. Last summer, he was living in Chicago and attending the Zen Buddhist temple out there, died. Beyond the number of people that die by suicide each year, 12 million adults seriously think about suicide. And if all the people who seriously thought about suicide lived in the same state, it would be the 7th largest state in the country, bigger than Ohio. 3.5 million make a plan, and 1.2 million adults attempted suicide in 2020. In 2019, 9% of high school students reported that they had made at least one suicide attempt in the past 12 months. Jack was one of those 1.3 million high school students. In the past few years, even before COVID, there's been an alarming spike of children presenting to the hospital and emergency departments with thoughts of suicide or suicide attempts. We're in an unprecedented mental health crisis. Suicide is an epidemic that affects all of us, and also no one is immune from suicide. In the intervention workshop that I facilitate, we talk about suicide being something like a river. That's one of the images or metaphors that the curriculum uses. And the river of suicide has a lot of contributaries or streams that can pull somebody into that river of thoughts and actions. And there's a lot of different causes and conditions that can bring people to think about it. Another few myths are that only people living with mental illness think about or die by suicide, or that once someone is suicidal, they'll always remain that way. Studies have shown that approximately 54% of individuals who died by suicide did not have a diagnosable mental health disorder. And active ideation is often short-term and situation-specific. The average acute crisis only lasts a few minutes. And some studies that interviewed people seen in the hospital following a suicide attempt showed that 48% said they had only thought about it and contemplated suicide within 10 minutes before making the attempt. Psychological autopsies that are done show that 42% of people had serious relationship problems, 29% had a recent or anticipated crisis within the past or upcoming 2 weeks, 28% had problematic substance use, 22% had physical health problems, or 16% job and financial problems. Some people have more than one of these factors or situations going on. In the Soul Shop workshop a few weeks ago that I mentioned, that we hosted for religious leaders, the presenter walked the participants through the characters and stories in the Bible that either died by suicide or struggled with thoughts of suicide. There's probably more than you may know or thought. The presenter made an argument that we could see suicidality in biblical characters like Saul and Ahithophel, Samson, Judas, Jonah, Paul's prison guard, and of course, Job. The Buddhist canon, both the Pali canon and the Mahayana canons, are replete with similar types of stories that can be interpreted in that lens. There's a Pali Sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya called the Channa Sutta about the monk Channa, who died by suicide following a severe and incurable illness. Also in the same Nikaya, the Godika Sutta about the monk Godika, who died after falling into despair. And there's another story about a monk, Vakali, who also died Interestingly, in all three of these cases, the Buddha does not condemn any of the monks that died by suicide and states that they all attained nirvana and were not reborn. Of course, these cases are all open to interpretation and have been the interest and subject of debate for Buddhist scholars for a very long time. There's also the case of Subhadra, the last monk ordained by the Buddha himself right before the Buddha's own death. And according to some accounts, Subhadra felt that he was unworthy to witness the passage of the Buddha into parinirvana and asked the Buddha permission to die first, and the Buddha gave him permission. So from some of the texts, it's not clear, though, if Subhadra did in fact take his own life or not, but stands at least as an example of ideation. And there's also several Jataka tales, the legends of the Buddha's prior births that feature suicide or self-sacrifice, like the Jataka, the starving tiger. This is a tale, a story that tells the story of a mother tiger who had just given birth to a litter of cubs and is crazed with hunger and is about to eat her own cubs. And seeing this, the Bodhisattva, the Buddha in his previous birth, casts himself off the cliff to save the mother tiger and her cubs. In the tale of the selfless hare, the Buddha again is reborn as a rabbit and throws himself into a fire for the benefit of others, so others can eat and survive. And you also see mentions like this in the Lotus Sutra as well, too. So it can be really difficult and confusing to really get a hold on some of these stories of the way that they're sometimes written about and interpreted. Scanning and interpreting Buddhist scripture and literature and history can be confusing at best, trying to get a hold of a definitive position. While most would clearly cite the first precept, not to kill or take life, as a blanket prohibition against suicide, we can see throughout all this different literature and history that the moral implications and even consequences are complex and nuanced, especially when in certain texts it appears that suicide or self-sacrifice is often praised or valorized or considered blameless. For me, though, I don't see consistent authoritative prescriptive attitudes, but rather immense compassion and understanding and forgiveness from the Buddha himself towards monks who were suffering, both physically and mentally. So in preparing this talk, it was too easy to come across opinions and commentaries on the internet about the wrongness or badness of suicide from a Buddhist perspective, condemnation or worse, threats or guarantees of suffering and future rebirths. In my experience and through what I've learned, arguing or lecturing someone who's in despair is almost never a helpful approach, and often only further isolates someone already in despair. The one opinion, though, that did stand out and resonate with me that I saw in preparing this was that some of you may know this author, a Zen author, Brad Warner, and he wrote about this some years ago. And so these are his words that Brad Warner says: "Even if we really do get reborn after we die, how can anyone say what sort of next life the person is likely to have, knowing only the fact that the person killed themselves? There's a lot more to any individual's life than just how it ends. For those that believe in rebirth, the entirety of the person's life determines how he or she will be reborn, not just the last thing the person did. When dealing with suicide, vague speculations about rebirth don't really help. It's a way to avoid the real question of what do we do when faced with the fact that someone we cared about killed themselves. No one ever knows the right thing to do or to say when something like this happens. It's more important just to be supportive. In fact, I'd say that discussing what sort of next life the person is likely to have is one of the least supportive things you could do." And I agree with that. So in the training that I've compiled for our chaplain students in the hospital and the suicide intervention workshops that we do, we start by learning how to discover what are our attitudes about suicide, and how might our attitudes be helpful or not helpful to someone who's living with thoughts of suicide. We reflect on our attitudes and consider the potential advantages or disadvantages of holding particular attitudes through asking ourselves questions like, is suicide wrong? Do people have a right to suicide? Are people who die by suicide responsible for their actions or not? Are there limits to what I will do to prevent suicide? The spoiler here is that you can see potential advantages and disadvantages to both sides of the spectrum on all of these questions, and there are no absolutes. In the training that we do, we learn about facts and statistics. I shared a few of those with you. We clarify myths and assumptions. We learn about the history of suicide, psychological and sociological theories, risk factors, warning signs, how to use sensitive and trauma-informed language. We listen and watch lived experience and testimonials, how to resist stigma and taboo. And we do role plays, check our understanding, review our own cases, like I reviewed my care with Jack. We think about how we've been impacted, and we learn how to ask directly about suicide, how to acknowledge and validate pain, reasons for dying, how to lean into stories, how to listen and identify and hear those life connections and reasons for living as well. We learn how to co-create and develop safety plans, how to recognize and reinforce and encourage life protectors and life promoters, how to care for ourselves in the midst of vicarious and secondary trauma, and how to journey along with someone as they consider and try to remember or discover their reasons for living and how to stay safe. One of my favorite depictions of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion that I mentioned a few minutes ago, is the Juichi Senju Sengen Kannon, which is the Japanese name for the 11-faced, 1,000-armed, and 1,000-eyed Bodhisattva, which looks something like this. This is one kind of illustration of it. So you can see lots of hands and heads and eyes like that there, right? So in this picture, the Bodhisattva is equipped with a plethora of tools and skill and expedient means to help those who are suffering. There's no one right way to help somebody. The Bodhisattva is equipped. Right? So all the parts of the prevention and intervention workshops and training, the self-examination, the skills, the knowledge, the experiences, and stories are like these precious instruments and tools that the Bodhisattva wields. The good news is that you don't have to be a mental health professional or a clinician or have any special degree to pick up and practice most of these tools. Creating suicide-safer communities are within all of our power, and we can find ways to help. So before you leave here today, take a look at the top of the bookcases outside in the Sangha room. Before we came in, I left a number of handouts and resources for you to take. There are wallet cards that you can take that have the number for the suicide lifeline, the 988 number on it, that you can take for yourself or hand out to others. There's a directory of dozens of supportive resources throughout the community that offer all kinds of assistance. Links to suicide prevention organizations that provide guidance and tip sheets. There's another sheet out there of low-cost suicide prevention training that's open to everyone, like QPR gatekeeper training, mental health first aid, or living work start. And if any of this is resonating and you want to go a step further, you can join my next workshop in September, the one that I mentioned about earlier, the 2-day workshop where you learn how to do a complete suicide intervention and how to help lead somebody to safety through creating a safety plan with them. So while the river of suicide is scary and dangerous and that current can be really strong at times, you can be a life raft or that hand that pulls someone to shore. Our Dharma brother, Dustin, who tragically took his own life last summer, was given the Dharma name Anakala, which means not confused. So it's my hope that this talk today will shed a bit more light on an all too often silenced topic, that we can move forward with more clarity and more compassion, and break through some of our own confusion when suicide pops up in our own circles and our own communities, and hope we can all move into embodying the spirit of Anakala. There's training, there's resources, and there's support available. And if you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, please know there are people who care and want to help. You can reach out to me or Bup Mee Sunim or use the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 anytime. So I'll close with this. During Soul Shop 2 weeks ago, we were asked by the facilitator to write a corporate prayer, a group prayer shared by all. And the rule was it had to include the word suicide. And amongst the group, there were prayers shared by Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Catholics, Pentecostals, Apostolics, and Buddhists. This is the prayer that I wrote. O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, endowed with all-knowing wisdom and loving compassion, giving protection and guidance to all sentient beings, we invoke your presence and ask that you hear our prayer. O compassionate ones, so many of our beloved brothers and sisters, for a myriad of reasons, causes, and conditions, find themselves suffering in suicidal desperation. O compassionate ones, so many of our brothers and sisters feel hopeless and cannot see any way out of their long suffering. They are stuck in a dark tunnel of fear, sadness, unworthiness, and isolation. O compassionate ones, may you hear their cries and ease their pain. May you shine your light so that they may see more possibilities, even if just a glimmer of hope or uncertainty, to stay for one more day. O compassionate ones, may you share your resolve and strength with our brothers and sisters who are contemplating suicide and can't find a reason to live. May you comfort them and share with them your wisdom, compassion, love, and light. O compassionate ones, may you grant us the strength, courage, and fortitude to be caregivers for our brothers and sisters, for us to show up, be present, and embody your noble equanimity. May we be so empowered and energized to not turn away in fear or be deluded by discomfort or anxiety. May we be granted all the resources we need to be helpful. O compassionate ones, for all who are suicide survivors, either through their own lived experience or have been bereaved, may you comfort them as well and help see the love and strength of the community that they are also not alone. O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, manifest now your ancient vows and help us become Bodhisattvas ourselves that cultivate suicide-safer sanghas and communities. Namu Guanseambo Sal Om Maridara Sabaha Namu Devan Kwangbo Hwaom Gyong Om Horo Horo Saya Moke Sabaha Om Bashaje 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 Samud Gate Svaha.